right, this morning, as we continue our study in the parables, we're going to look at the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. We find that in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Someone would turn there for us and read that brief passage. I would appreciate it. Okay. Okay, thank you, Doug. All right, so in this parable, Jesus introduces two characters. I think I want to take a look at them briefly. The first, a Pharisee. What is a Pharisee? Anybody know? Right. Pharisee comes from the Hebrew title or name of Perishim, which just means the separated ones. The Pharisees arose about 200 years before Jesus came on the scene in the 2nd century BC. And this movement, if you will, was a response to the encroachment of Greek culture, what we call today Hellenism, what they called then Hellenism, the encroachment of that on Jewish society. And the issue that the Pharisees were trying to address was, how do you continue to live and maintain your Jewishness when you're bombarded all around with these outside influences, these non-Jewish influences? How do you maintain that? So they thought of themselves as being separate from that. And as they developed over time, they acquired three main characteristics, I would say. They were highly focused on maintaining their ritual purity, keeping themselves separated from any outside influences, especially the Hellenistic influences that was all around them, seemed to be encroaching upon them and making it more difficult to maintain their identity as Jews. So they're highly focused on maintaining ritual purity. They believed that God gave Moses actually two laws, the written law and an oral law. And that oral law is really what Jesus is referring to when he talks about their traditions. And then thirdly, they used this oral law, these traditions, to build a sort of let's say a fence, a protection around the written law, so they could avoid any possibility they might accidentally break the written law. So if you will, a little diagram, that's the written law, the small box. Around it, they erected this fence, this outer wall of their oral law, their traditions that protected it, so that, if this is what the written law encompassed, if they had this greater barrier extending around it, there's no way they'd have a chance of accidentally breaking one of those written laws. And that's what the Pharisees were all about. Now, if we didn't have the Gospels and what Jesus had to say in his criticism of the Pharisees, you might think their solution they came up with was a pretty good one. I mean, think about it. This is the law. If I erect a barrier around it, then I won't break that law. And it sounds good. What's the problem with that? Right. And what happens when man tries to improve on what God has said and what God has instructed?
God said don't add.
He said don't add to it. Yeah. They're breaking his law just by doing that. That's right. I would say that they're not just treading on thin ice. They've fallen through the ice already. Just that the idea that they can improve on what God has already said is a problem in and of itself. So over time, this oral law or their traditions, it grew to cover more and more situations that arose in daily life of the Jewish community. As things changed around them, they had to keep adding to, and it grew and grew, and eventually, it became more impossible to obey than the written law. But the Pharisees, they were proud of their righteous attempt to shield themselves from breaking God's law. So the problem, in addition to that, is they often became hypocrites. They themselves were not able to comply with their own observations and instructions about the law. Everyone had trouble obeying all their traditions, even themselves. And then on top of that, you can see, well, Jesus had the criticism in Matthew 23, verses 4 and 5, where he said, speaking of the Pharisees, for they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen by men. Those are the Pharisees. The other character he introduces here is the tax collector. Now, tax collectors, I think you have to understand their position and how they came about. Under the Roman system of government, the task of collecting taxes was awarded to the highest bidder. Whoever gave them the promise, the highest bid for collecting taxes in a certain area, they'd win the bid, and then they immediately had to pay the Roman authorities that amount. They had to come up. So they had this elaborate system. Sometimes you'd have like a consortium of individuals getting together and lumping their resources together. Sometimes people would go out and borrow money and pay interest on that loan to have the money to give to the Roman government. So now they're in a deep hole. They have all this debt. Well, how are they going to recoup that? What's the incentive for even bidding on the contract? Well, the incentive was whatever you collected over and above what you gave to the Roman government, you got to keep. That was your profit margin. So obviously, the only incentive for bidding on that contract was to figure out ways to gather even more money than what you gave to the Romans. You squeeze everything you could out of the local citizenry. You even came up with arbitrary taxes and arbitrary fees for this and that. Whatever they could think of, they did. And because they're legally allowed to keep whatever they collected over and above what they paid the Roman government, they had the backing of the Roman military. They could seize property, whether you liked it or not. Just come and take it. So tax collectors gained a notoriety of being corrupt, being greedy, being extortionists. I mean, they were the lowest of the low. And I think some of the tactics they might use, I think, comes out if you read between the lines a little bit even in the story of Zacchaeus. The story of Zacchaeus, I think we're all aware of that. He's a tax collector, and Jesus comes, going to stay with him. It says in verse 8, it says, then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor. And notice this next one. And if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Now, why would he say this if that wasn't a practice? That was another practice, You just lie about what someone owed. The Roman authorities are there to back you up. You can get away just about anything. So when the Romans conquered a nation, it was their common practice. You hire tax collectors from the local population. After all, as an occupying army, you're already hated enough. Why not deflect some of that hatred onto someone else? It was just an easy thing to do. Tax collectors in Judea were despised by virtually everyone, but especially the Pharisees. You know how the Pharisees looked at these people. They viewed them as sinners. They were greedy. They were corrupt. They were thieves. They were hated for collaborating with the Romans. I mean, think about it. They're helping the Romans to subjugate their own people. They're traitors. And of course, they're considered by the Pharisees as being ritually impure. They were so polluted by their association with Gentiles. You had to associate with Gentiles, you're a tax collector. You had to handle that foreign currency, that Roman currency. Whose image was on the currency? Caesar's. It was a graven image. They touched a graven image. According to their oral law, their tradition, this would render them ceremonial unclean. You couldn't go near one. And interesting when you look at the parable of it. Pharisees in one place and standing afar off is the tax collector. I don't think it's necessarily the tax collector wanted to be afar off. I think the Pharisee probably made sure he was nowhere near that tax collector. He was not going to, make himself unclean by coming too close to him. Any comments or questions so far?
I was just thinking it's interesting that Jesus chose one of his apostles to be a tax collector.
Yes, he did. Of course, he was always, the accusation over and over again by the Pharisees was, well, he associates with who? Sinners and tax collectors. Tax collectors were more than just sinners. They were traitors. They were unclean. Why would you associate with them? That's the view of the Pharisees.
If the coins and stuff, because of Caesar's face, made them impure or unclean, did the Pharisees not find the money? Yeah, I don't understand that.
They would probably want to just be associated with, the temple shekel, temple money. They would do everything they could, to avoid touching it, which would be difficult. But they were pretty fanatic. Many of them were pretty fanatic about it. Okay. He starts off and he says, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. That word trusted there, it's an interesting word. It actually means it means to be convinced, to persuade. By their own logic, their own reasoning, they came to the conclusion in their own minds that they were the righteous ones, without any regard to what God's word actually said. Paul quotes Psalm 14 in Romans 3:10. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. They totally ignored that. Think about that. The audacity just to ignore God's word and decide with your own logic and your own reasoning that you're righteous. Are there people that do that today? Greg mentioned it on Wednesday night. It's like faith without works is dead. A lot of people want to ignore that. Works don't have anything to do with that they were righteous. Of course, Paul goes on to say in verse that they were righteous. Of course, Paul goes on to say in verse 23 of Romans 3 that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And not only to convince themselves that they were the truly righteous ones, they despised others. Now look at this word, despised. The root definition there is to hold and treat as of no account. They didn't even think people were worth their time and effort to even think about, let alone communicate with or have any contact with. Despise them. They're just so beneath them. Don't even think of them. That's an interesting attitude to have if you think about yourself being righteous. It's kind of contradictory. I thought maybe we'd get a better idea of exactly what their attitude is. There's a brief account in John chapter 9, the story of the man who was born blind. Jesus, spits in the dirt and makes some clay, and he puts it on his eyes and tells him to go wash, and he washes. And he can see again. He comes back, and Pharisees get involved. Why do they get involved? Well, it was a Sabbath. Of course, he must have broken the law. He made clay on the Sabbath to heal this man. They bring him in, they interrogate him, they interrogate his parents. Parents don't want anything to do with this situation. They're afraid. They send him, because, you have any questions, talk to our son. So he starts out in verse 24. He says, they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he's a sinner or not, I do not know. But one thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want also to become his disciples? Then they reviled him, just heaped abuse upon him, and said, you are his disciple. We are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered and said to him, you are completely born in sins, and you are teaching us? And they cast him out. I'll give a little emphasis to some of those lines, but I think that's kind of how it went. Yes, Ramona.
Just trying to justify, the things that they practice.
Yeah, kind of wonder. Yeah, they were truly the blind ones. You're right.
They were threatened. Their whole system was threatened by Christ. If Christ was the Messiah, and from God, their whole system was going to fall apart.
That's true. Yeah, they were threatened. Their system would be gone, and they didn't like that idea at all. Yeah. True. So we can see kind of the contempt that they had for anyone they felt was beneath them. And they started their questioning really with the mindset that Jesus' disciples started this whole passage out with. In verse 2, he says, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus tries to correct them and go, no, that's not it. And yet the Pharisees had already determined that he was a sinner because he was born blind. Obvious conclusion to them. Not obvious to Jesus, obviously.
Job and his friends, you've sinned because of all this bad stuff that's happened.
Right. Yeah. The friends of Job had the same attitude. Sin results in things bad happening to you, which is kind of a fallacy. Okay. Then he said, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself to God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. That word stood. It's the same word that Luke used when talking about the temptations of Christ in chapter 4. When Satan, it says in chapter 4, then he brought him, Satan brought him, Jesus, to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple. That word set, it's the same thing. Placed there purposely. The Pharisee placed himself where he was at purposely. And just get up randomly. He wanted to be right where he was, far away from that tax collector, well, more than likely where others could see him. And we'll get to that in a minute. And he prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. Who's the Pharisee focused on in this prayer? Himself. Yeah. God is mentioned, but he's not the focus of his prayer.
He said, Jesus said he's focused to those who trusted in themselves. Well, we're supposed to trust in God
Right.
for righteousness. Who, and then he prayed with himself. So it's almost like he's praying with himself, sort of to me, in my mind. Himself, he's praying to himself. So he's God.
Yep.
I mean, he wouldn't have did that.
True. He wouldn't admit
No.
he wouldn't admit to having a mindset that he's basically equal to God. Yeah, but that's kind of what it seems like. And we'll get more into that in a minute. He trusted himself. I'm not like other men. Is that really true? Paul already said, we mentioned, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And yet he seems to be elevating himself again to the level of God, concluding in his own mind, by his own reasoning and logic, that I'm righteous. I'm not an extortioner. I'm not greedy. I'm not corrupt. I'm not unjust. Meaning I'm not wicked. I'm not an adulterer. I'm morally upright. Look at me, God. I'm not a tax collector. And of course, the tax collector, he would lump into all those things that he just said. Extortioner, unjust. On top of that, he's a traitor to his own people. I'm not like that. He also is focused on who else might be there. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 6, verse 5, when he talked about these types of people? And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. Why? For they love to pray standing in the synagogues. Now, this guy's not just standing in the synagogue, he's standing in the temple. And on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Don't be like that. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. As Jesus concludes this parable, you can see that, yeah? He has his reward already, this Pharisee. He did not get the mercy from God, the justification that the tax collector did. And of course, again, he's focused on that tax collector over there. Boy, I'm glad I'm not like that. He goes on to say, I fast twice a week and to give tithes of all I possess. Now think about that for a minute. I fast twice a week. What did the law require? It required 1 day of fasting every year, the Day of Atonement. He's fasting twice a week, 100 times more. I give tithes of all that I possess. I'm ahead of myself for a minute. Again, according to the law of Moses, tithes were due not on everything, not on all your gains, but only what the land produced and what your livestock produced. But the Pharisees, they tithed everything, even things that they purchased. So they go and buy something, they got to give a tithe on the purchase price, because something that they gained. Not what the law said. So again, in fasting twice a week, I'm paying tithes on everything. In their minds, well, if the Day of Atonement by the law makes me righteous in the sight of God, and I fast on that day, then if I fast twice a week, well, my righteousness must be increased by 100 times. The law requires me to tithe just on my what the land produces and what my livestock produce, but I tithe everything that I gain. I'm more righteous. Logical in their minds. That's their reasoning. They trusted in themselves. They convinced themselves. They persuaded themselves because they did all the extra things that increased their righteousness. It's similar to what Paul says in Romans chapter 6, if grace is so good, then why don't we just sin more? And God will bestow more grace, and grace will abound. Logical. Illogical when you look at the truth of it. And that's the same thing that the Pharisees are confronting here. The idea, if I do over and above what the law requires, God will impute to me more and more righteousness. If you're righteous, can you be more righteous? I mean, God has already said you're righteous. Can you really have more righteousness? I'm not so sure you can. Now, some may be more righteous than others, but it's a quantifying thing there that we got to be careful of, because that's a trap the Pharisees fell into. Any questions or comments?
They didn't even realize they were flesh and bones, like they're mortal or something. It's kind of baffling that they thought that.
Their logic was illogical.
Right, I know, I'm just.
Maria.
I was just thinking that Jesus was so patient in that he took the time to do all this teaching and to answer questions, and he took the insults and everything, so that one of the most famous Pharisees of all, Paul, would be a Christian. So, and chief priests and everybody, some of them became Christians as well, because Jesus was so patient and that he took the time to teach, to say, okay, this is what's wrong. And, anybody that would have received that, then they could correct themselves, because of what Jesus said. But he was just really patient to put up with it so much.
Yeah. Jesus was patient with them. God is patient with us. Thank goodness for that patience. Thank God for that patience. So the Pharisees, this Pharisee had his list for God of his do's and his don'ts, I'd say. The bad things that he's avoided and the good things that he has made sure to do. Got his list. I'm not like other men. I'm not an extortioner. I'm not unjust. I'm not an adulterer. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all my possessions.
And he also doesn't think he needs anything, because he doesn't ask for anything at all.
Right. He doesn't need any righteousness. He's done all these great things, and so he's got this abundance of righteousness already, not really understanding his state. He's got this list of brownie points, if you will, and it appears, someone kind of mentioned before, he has an expectation that God owes him. I've done all this, God, you owe me. God should have praised and exalt him for how wonderful he is. Do we ever fall into that trap ourselves? Think about it. Let's see. I don't drink. I don't smoke. Read my Bible every day. Pray every day. I attend church on Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Wednesday evening. Make a contribution every Sunday. Yep, I've done my part, God. You do yours now, God should appreciate all I've done, right? Is that our attitude? Do we slip into that sometimes? I hope not. It's called pride. Yeah. Like that Pharisee. I. Yeah. A lot of I's in there. Yes.
Jesus in Matthew 23 had a lot to say about the Pharisees. he called them hypocrites in multiple places. In verse 23, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith." And so I think that would tie into what we're seeing here with this Pharisee and his prayer of all that he does. Jesus says you know, pay attention to these things, but you're forgetting the weightier matters of the law. And Jesus then goes on to say, of course, being Jesus, he says, these you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. And so Jesus says you need to continue to tithe as you're tithing. That's fine, but there's also the weightier matters of the law, and you don't decide and divide those up. You need to do all of them.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's kind of the problem with the Pharisees. They were checking off the boxes. Yeah. I've done this, I've done this, I've not done that, I've not done that. What they didn't see the bigger picture. They were so focused on the minutia, they didn't see the bigger picture of justice, mercy, faith. Yeah. They somehow they lost track of those things when they put those blinders on and focused on that narrow focus of what the law said to do and not to do, rather than the reasons behind they were to do certain things and not to do others. That's the justice, the mercy, and the faith. Ramona.
Kind of goes back to Matthew 7:22, which we are all familiar with. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? Then I would declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.
Yeah. Very good point. Okay. To do all these things that the Pharisee did was not bad in and of itself. You just didn't get this point, which Jesus made in Luke 17:10. So likewise, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. So even if you did everything God commanded, it wasn't enough. That's just what was expected. That in and of itself didn't earn you righteousness. God decided to impute that to you based on your faith and what you did with your faith.
The beginning of, I think it's 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, and it's all these things that we can do, these great things that we can do. But if we don't have any love, then it doesn't mean anything. It's just a lot of noise and stuff. So he did a lot of great things, he did, but he didn't give God the glory.
Didn't give God. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Picture, if you will, this Pharisee standing there in the temple, as the custom was, and raising his hands up to heaven, and proudly and confident in his righteousness, he boasts of his innocence and his righteous acts of fasting and tithing. And compare that then to the tax collector. He's too ashamed even to look up to heaven. He beats his breast in anguish and begs for God's mercy. Both men were Israelites, so both men were in a covenant relationship with God. But only the second one realizes that he has not and cannot fulfill his obligations under that covenant, but needs God's mercy to maintain the covenant relationship. We are under a new covenant, but our situation really hasn't changed. No matter how obedient we try to be, no matter how much good we might be able to do, we still need God's mercy to maintain a relationship. And the only way to obtain that mercy and be justified is to humble ourselves. As James says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. And Peter says, Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. So my final question for you, what does it mean to humble yourself before God? What does that really mean?
You need to see God for who he is. That he's the righteous one, he's the holy one, and you need to see yourself for who you are.
Ourselves, which is the opposite of, me first, everything is self. So that's hard to deny ourselves.
So to acknowledge that he has all the authority. We have to realize and accept that we're dependent upon him. We have to be obedient. And when we're not obedient, we need to realize it through self-examination and then repent. That's what it means, I think, to humble ourselves before God. When I think of being humble, I often think of what Paul told the Philippians in chapter 2, verse 3. He said, let nothing be done with selfish ambition or conceit. I think we can see that Pharisee is pretty conceited. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. The Pharisee totally failed in that. Totally failed. All right. I thank you for your participation this morning. It's a good class.